Hello everyone. I've been back to visit an old friend again, fellow Renault enthusiast Joe, who seems to have the same affliction as I do, only far worse, because he's been buying some more Renaults again. Now occasionally life presents you with a golden opportunity to pick up that car that perhaps you've missed earlier in life. Today I'm driving the Renault 11, and what I'm going to find out is, did Joe strike a golden opportunity, or did he buy a golden nugget? Stick around, we'll find out. Regular channel viewers will know that I'm a big fan of Renaults, especially those from the 1980s and 90s, which are the cars that I really grew up with. Now admittedly most of ours were the Renault 5, although very briefly my dad did own a Renault 9. Now the Renault 9 and Renault 11 are essentially the same vehicle under the skin. The 9 arrived slightly earlier on the continent at the back end of 1981 and early 1982 in the UK. A year later the 11 arrived. From the front the cars look very similar, but it's at the back where the real differences are noticed, because the 11 is a 3 or 5 door hatchback with that wraparound rear glazing, and the Renault 9 a more traditional saloon car. In some markets, saloons still remain very popular, even after the rise of the hatchback. Now Renault had not done so well with the 14, and they were looking to shake the range up a little bit in the early 1980s. When the 9 actually landed in most markets in 82, it had already won the prestigious 1982 European Car of the Year award. The 11, as I say, joined a year later, and this is actually a Robert Opron design. There's actually a few telltale signs in here. It's got that wraparound rear glass, very much like the Renault 25 of the era. It's also a feature that was quite prominent on the sporty Renault Fuego. The 11 and the Fuego both actually featured in the classic Roger Moore James Bond film A View to a Kill. Now the Fuego has probably gone unnoticed in that film by most. The 11 on the other hand, well yes, it's the car that ended up cut in half driving around Paris. That one actually looked a plusher TSE or TXE spec car. The car I'm driving today though is a mid-spec GTL. So at launch the car could be had as the TC trim with an 1108cc engine. Again, that I would imagine would probably struggle somewhat. Later in life Renault did actually replace that with the 1200 engine, the 1239. The engine in this car though is the 1397cc engine. It's actually quite primitive. It's chain-driven cam-in block with short push rods which act on rockers, which obviously operate the 2 valves per cylinder this car has. The 1397 came in various guises from around 60 horsepower to around 70 horsepower depending on configuration. The GTL gained you a few little extras, such as the centre air vents here next to these rather interesting heating controls. It also gained you things like a temperature gauge and an oil gauge, as opposed to just a speedo and a fuel gauge in the base model car. We've got a rather compact glove box in here, but I do like this centre console. We've actually got a very period correct push button radio in this car. Obviously radio cassettes could be had as well. Actually the higher spec car, the TXE, the they actually did a TXE Electronique, which would be my pick of the bunch. TXE Electronique actually had the double stack, the double DIN radio with the equaliser and everything, and you actually got a digidash and a voice synthesizer, and Renault actually managed to bring that car to market. I think it was a matter of weeks before the Maestro with its voice synthesizer, making it the first car in its class to have such incredibly 80s technology. Now, one thing anyone who's driven an old Renault of this era will tell you is that the seats are very, very comfortable, and in this car it's no exception. Okay, so we haven't got the petal-shaped seats of the higher spec TSE and TXE, or indeed the Turbo, but they still feel relatively supportive. And something else Renault did is they mounted the seat runners actually quite close together in the centre, so that rear seat passengers can actually put the feet at either side of the seat runners to give the feeling of more room. It's quite interesting. While we're on the subject of space and comfort, I've got plenty of headroom in this car. I'm about 5'9", and I've got a couple of inch of grace in here, which is a little bit more than I've got in my Megane Coupe. Space in the back, again, perfectly adequate. It's surprisingly spacious and comfortable in here. Back in the 1980s, cars were built rather different to what they are now. Yes, things like crumple zones were starting to come in, but yeah, you didn't seem to have the amount of lost space that you get in modern cars. Everything seemed a little bit thinner in the way it was constructed. The upshot of that is we've got a car that is spacious and comfortable, but that weighs a mere 800 odd kilos. In fact, I think even in the heaviest guys, these cars all came in at less than a ton. And I can certainly feel it as well. Now, one discovery I made this morning is that this car doesn't have power steering. Now, that didn't really come as a surprise. What did come as a surprise though is that the steering is actually quite light, even at very low speeds. The car seems very, very easy to manoeuvre. Of course, being from the 1980s, visibility is excellent. We've got lots of glass around this car. So under the forward tilting bonnet of the 11, we have the heart of the beast, the legendary Cléon Font engine. Now, to be honest, this engine you could probably make a video about all on its own. The Cléon Font had a history spanning around 40 years. Originally named the Sierra engine all the way back in 1962. It went into cars like the Caravelle and the Renault 8 in various guises. Started off at 956cc with a mere 40 odd horsepower. By the time Renault had finished with it, well, it had been in all manner of vehicles. Even in the Renault Twingo, the first generation car. Most powerful variant, that would have been in the Maxi 5 Turbo, where it produced a whopping 385 brake horsepower. Now, the Cléon Font is a cast iron block with an alloy head. We even got some versions of this engine that were breathed on by Gordini with a hemispherical head. Over the years, it ended up in many different configurations, mounted at the back of the car, driving the rear wheels, and then eventually front mounted but longitudinal in cars like the Renault 5. By the time the Super Sang and the Renault 9 and this Renault 11 came along though, the Cléon Font was actually almost due for retirement, but it got a reprieve with the JB gearbox. The engine got mounted transversely driving the front wheels, and it actually lived on in this form for quite a number of years. So this car, being a GTL, has actually got a 1397cc engine, although as I say, it did come in a whole range of different engine capacities. The smallest incarnation actually to go in the Renault 11 was the 1108, and with a 4-speed gearbox. Obviously I've not driven that one, but I did have an 1108 in my Renault 5, and the gut feeling is it probably would feel somewhat strange, particularly on hills. love coming up here to see Joe. We've got some fantastic roads up here. In fact, some of you may recall a little over a year ago, I actually came up here and drove the 16 valve Megane coupe he had at the time, and yeah, rather enjoyed it. Anyway, back to the topic of the 11. So I got in this car earlier and quickly discovered it doesn't have power steering. Now, this doesn't really come as a surprise. A lot of cars of this size in the 80s didn't have power assisted steering back in the day. What did surprise me though is how light the steering actually was. Even manoeuvring at low speeds, it just felt really easy to manoeuvre. Obviously this car has currently got its original 1980s steering wheel on, but you know, it doesn't feel too bus-like, and it certainly does look very 80s. Feels a lot nicer than I remember these wheels feeling as well. Now, usually when you've got a car where the steering is a bit light and the suspension's a bit soft, everything can feel a little bit loose. And admittedly these cars were known for having a very French ride quality, but that doesn't mean that it's all floppy. The real big surprise is that the steering on this car is really direct, probably owing to the fact that it's not assisted in any way. Incidentally, the pedal placement's quite close in this car, which makes it really easy to heel and tow. Pedals are very slightly offset to the right, but nowhere near as much as I remembered them being. But yeah, as I say, suspension ride is really soft on these cars, but not to the point where I feel I'm being bounced around. I mean, this road surface isn't the greatest, shall we say, and I feel quite confident with this car to cruise along this road at 50 to 60 miles per hour in 4th or 5th gear, and yeah, the car just feels really direct. That's probably been the biggest surprise about this. I just expected it to be like driving a blancmange, which as I say, would have been very typical of French cars from this era. Yeah, you can see why developing countries liked cars like this, and in fact I think in Turkey the 11 was actually still manufactured right up until 2000. In the UK and Europe, obviously, this model was superseded by the Renault 19 in 1989, and then in 1996 by the Mark 1 Megane. As it happens though, under the skin, these are actually all the same car. McPherson struts up front, trailing arms at the rear, a negative offset geometry on the steering on this car, and yeah, it really does feel all the better for it. Now, one car we've got to mention obviously is the turbo. Yep, Renault were big into turbocharging in the 1980s. Everyone remembers the Renault 5, but the cars that have probably gone under the radar are the Renault 11 and the Renault 9 turbo. Use that same 1.4 litre Garrett turbocharged engine. In the early incarnations on the 11 we were looking at 105 horsepower. Doesn't sound a lot, but again, as I say, bear in mind how light these cars are. I think later on they got up to about 115 horsepower in the 11. The car was obviously facelifted in 1987. And we got the sort of smoother front end, sort of brought it into line with the style of the 21. In fact, if you got the saloon version of this car, the Renault 9, in a facelift, I think the higher spec cars, if you squint, they do have a very look of a Renault 21 turbo about them. Incidentally, where saloon cars are often more expensive than their hatchback counterparts, if you look at certain models from sort of 1987, the turbo in particular, the two versions were exactly the same price. So yeah, you really could have the choice between a 4-door saloon or a 3 or 5-door hatchback, and it wouldn't have really set you back any major difference in monetary terms. The turbos obviously did get campaigned in rallying as well, with some success. My pick though would have been the TXE with that 1721cc engine, which would have given you 90 horsepower and probably a little bit more torque than what we've got in this car. That said though, again, this car actually goes alright. From cold, when I was climbing a hill, it did feel like it was a little bit bogged down, but once it warmed up and I got out onto the faster roads, yeah, this car's actually surprisingly nippy. It's never going to win any races, but yeah, because again it's light enough, it just feels great fun even with this amount of power. I'm not sure I'd want to try one with one of the smaller engines. I think that might feel a little bit laboured. I'm actually enjoying this car way more than I should be enjoying anything with this amount of power. These pre-facelift cars obviously have the quad headlamps, which give the car a more aggressive look. Strangely, the very early Renault 9s had a different front end, and then partway through Renault changed the front end on some models to bring it into line with this vehicle here. As I say, later on both cars actually got a midlife facelift anyway, and obviously changed again. Comfort on this is brilliant. I could drive this all day. In fact, as I say, developing countries, they had quite poor roads, and people loved old French cars because they were generally quite robust and very softly dampened. In fact, I think I could probably drive this across the desert in reasonable comfort. Well, that'd be an interesting question for the comments. What would you rather drive across the desert, a gold Rolls Royce or a gold Renault 11? Let me know in the comments down below. Obviously, I've got to say a big thank you to Joe for entrusting me with this car again. It's definitely been worth the hour-and-a-half drive to come up and drive this car. Again, if you're not a channel member, do check those out, £2.99 a month. You get early access to videos like this. And as always, thanks for watching. Hit that like button. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. Thanks for watching.